Hello, War of the Ring players. Bihali back with more games from the 2025 World Tournament for War of the Ring. This is from the round of 16. I played Euthoric. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. I apologize if I'm not. Euthoric also, as all of my previous opponents have done, kindly agreed to allow me to cast these matches. And let's get right to it. I started out as the free people. We randomized, I think technically as the higher seed, you get to pick which side you want to start with, but I genuinely don't care. So I'm always fine to go random. And I ended up with three people. Or sorry, I ended up with Shadow, and Euthoric ended up with three people. And let's get into it. So I start the way I always do with 0 eyes and roll 1. Fine. My opponent rolls 2 moves. So I've got my 2 musters. Pretty standard start to the game. I draw a strategy card. I'm going to start shuffling some armies. They move, are missed. I muster Isengard as you would expect. Move, missed again. Bring in Saruman now that the will is gone. Opponent chooses to muster Gondor. Sure, not unreasonable. They shuffle to Moria from North Dunland. I know there's a lot of debate about this. Is this actually worth it? I think it is, especially if you're holding the relevant combat cards. The devilry cards that are only turned on by having an Isengard unit present. I think generally if you're going to go for the Elf Pincer, it's good to get Lorien down early, of course, because there are 2 cards that help defend Lorien. But, at some point, you're going to draw that Devilry card, and it's great to be able to cycle it instead of just throw it out. And so having that extra Isengard unit there, turning on those cards, to me is worth it. Obviously, everything is situationally dependent, but in a game like this where I had plenty of moves, and one of the things I've mentioned in previous casts is I like to leave that Dol Guldur and Moria army in place rather than move them out on turn 1, just in case you draw one of the 3 recruitment cards that is relevant for those 2 locations. And so one of the things that bringing the Isengard unit into Moria does is, yeah, I mean, does it slow you down by a half move? Technically, yes, but it turns on those combat cards, and it also means that if you do happen to draw one of those recruiting cards turn 2, or you have a Palantir, either by top decking it, or you have Palantirs that allow you to draw more strategy cards, you're being actually in some ways more efficient by waiting to move out than by simply moving that Moria army out into Dimmeldale and leaving that unit in North Dunland. I think another minor optimization that is relevant is anytime I end up using Rage of the Dunlandings to go for either Shire or Rivendell, I like to have at least one elite be what I send out of North and South Dunland with Rage of the Dunlandings, because that means that with that army, you can attack with a sea die, for example. So it allows that army to be a lot more mobile and gives you access to more action dice to make potentially game-winning attacks in Shire or Rivendell. And so you're not really losing anything in terms of activating rage, because you're ultimately I'm going to want to use a recruit on North Dunland with an elite, and I'm going to need to use a second recruit. So I need 2 recruits anyway to get the maximum 4 guys out with rage, because I want to recruit an elite, not just 2 regulars in North, South, and Orthanc. And so, it still takes 2 musters to do 1 regular in North, 1 in South, 1 in Orthanc, and then 1 elite that I'd be spending anyway, even if I left that North Dunland unit behind. and didn't take it to Moria. Anyway, that's I don't know why I ended up talking about that for so long, but it's something that I know that there's been a lot of debate and discussion in some of the YouTube videos about it. That's my take. Elves get mustered, fair enough, and I move out of Morannon. Yeah, so as you can see, I still haven't committed to any attacks anywhere. I can still decide based on what dice I've shuffled some armies around, but I still have full flexibility over going Duline, going Lorien, going Gondor, potentially even going Rohan with these armies. I haven't yet committed to anything, and I've got my extra. I now have my 8th die, and I've positioned armies, but not actually sort of sent them in a way that commits them to one specific target. Okay. Draw Palantir, draw Shadows Moving, and great. So I'm curious if folks can guess what I'm going to do here. What does my opponent probably want to do? They want to get Gandalf. To do that, they are going to need that will, which means Palantir of Orthanc is probably a safe play right now. Because in addition to wanting to get that will, they're also going to want to know if they need to ring move with that H if they don't get hit with those first 2 moves with those C dice. So my opponent just sort of immediately takes off, and I just plunk Palantir down. Because now, you are you really going to use a ring on that H die to remove Palantir when instead you could use a ring on the H die to get Gandalf turn 2? Probably not, right? So I'm placing this bet that my opponent is I'm going to get 2 uses out of Palantir of Orthanc this turn by virtue of the fact that my opponent has dice that are he's almost certainly going to focus on getting Gandalf. And we kind of joke, he says nasty, and I said, yeah, you can remove it easily, which is true, but he obviously won't, which is why I played it so early in the turn. So my opponent goes ahead and moves, I hit, and so they do in fact get Gandalf with a kill there. Moria 1, fine. So I'm obviously going to use it right now, which I do. Play Shelob, great. Get a cycle in. And, now my opponent has a choice. Do they want to do they want to spend 1 ring and use this H to deny me another cycle with Palantir, or do they want to save that H, right? Like, one of the things that I could do with these dice that I have, if they give me a ring, right, one of the things I could then do with these dice is put Woodland Realm under siege, and I'm holding half orcs and goblin men in my hand now, and hill trolls. So, I can have a sizable army parked on Woodland Realm without the north moving into a blocking position in Old Forest Road. And even if they do that, I have, a swarm of bats. But I'm sure my opponent is thinking about wanting to use that H to either muster the elves or to block in Old Forest Road. So he ends up passing, and so that means I'm going to take my additional cycle here. And so I split up where I do my Hill Trolls muster. So now I've gotten 2 cycles out of this Palantir. So it's already been a highly effective use of that card. So I think my opponent... Oh, cat on the lap. That's very funny. So yeah, they use the H die to hide. There were a lot of potential uses for that H dice. One of the reasons that I think using it as a hide here is appropriate, I think this is the correct play, rather than using it to shuffle armies into, say, Westamnet or Old Forest Road, is Sauron's still not at war. I didn't roll a muster this turn. So they don't have to worry about being rushed by that Dol Guldur army. And they're going to get a fifth dice with Gandalf here because they still have this will showing. So I'm sure that my opponent was assuming that they had time to block Old Forest Road or something in the future, and they didn't need to use that H for that right in this moment. They preferred using the H to hide, which is totally legit, and that will, of course, is spoken for. So now, right, like, given that I've now gotten some musters out of Palantir of Orthanc, and I have Nazgul Strike in hand, I decide that I'm gonna go put some pressure on the Fellowship. So I get 2 rerolls parked on the Fellowship and commit to the sort of standard elf pincer that we see played in a lot of games. On to turn 3. So I now draw Morgul Wound and Nazgul Strike. So now I am thinking, is this potentially going to be a corruption game? I have the cards for it. Gandalf was lost fairly efficiently, but you know, I've gotten some Palantir cycles, and I don't roll any Palantirs. So, you know, that can happen when you play Palantir Vorthink. But what that means, of course, is that my opponent isn't incentivized to use that will to remove Palantir Vorthink. And I think that this is a a reasonable debate. When there are no, do you just gamble that you'll roll another will next turn, or do you remove Palantir on a turn when I have no Palantirs? Personally, I would hold the will here and not use it to remove Palantir Vorthank, or at the very least, I would have that be the very last thing I do, if I can, to figure out if I need that will for, you know, moving armies or something, or moving the Fellowship again. A little bit disappointing as Shadow here to not roll an additional eye. I could have just allocated 2, but I didn't want to end up with 4 eyes when this is a turn where I really wanted to get both Elven Strongholds under siege. So I wanted to maximize my chances of being able to do that. And I know that that's going to take basically 3 attacks in a muster. And so I wanted to roll all 7 available dice instead of just rolling 6. And a second muster. What I really want is What I really wanted is 2 musters and 3 attacks, and I got an extra attack and an extra muster because I want to be able to get the elves under siege and bring in the Witch King. Sauron to war, elves under siege, bring in the Witch King. So I didn't allocate more eyes. I think if I was in a slightly different board position, like if I didn't have the elves this under threat and the elves hadn't already been mustered once, I may have allocated 2 eyes, but in this case, didn't make sense to do that. So my opponent wisely musters the elves here first, so that whichever elven stronghold I put under siege, they're going to get a muster in the other one. So I bring Sauron to war and advance into Old Forest Road at Emeraldale. Sure. And I bring so now I want to put some. One of the things I can do here, because I rolled so many musters and so many attacks, is I can put some pressure on that will to make my opponent decide if they want to use it for something besides just removing Palantir of Orthanc. So I muster the Southrounds and Easterlings down. My opponent goes ahead and moves. I miss. And I decide to attack Lorien. So I I know that there are 2 schools of thought here. One is attack Woodland Realm first and make that a super cheap and easy to take stronghold, or attack Lorien first and take on 2 1/2/1 strongholds, assuming they don't have one of the mustering cards in hands. I prefer to do it this way. I think there's always the it's tempting to put Woodland Realm under siege first here. You then run the risk of running headfirst into maybe a Power 2 Grade or something like that being played. And then, yes, I have ways to remove it, but it would cost me a bunch of dice that I don't want to spend on that. So I decide to go ahead and attack into Lorien first. And I actually leave the Nazgul behind because I'm not intending to fight the Lorien siege first. I'm planning to fight the Woodland Realm siege first. So, that I'm leaving that Nazgul behind because I want the reroll, and I want all of my units in Lorien. I didn't want to leave an orc behind or something, because those Nazgul are eventually going to be moved with either a Palantir attack die or a C. So that puts the elves to war. Of course, there's a muster in Woodland Realm. I put Woodland Realm under siege. My opponent moves again. The Nazgul does not help, and I bring in the Witch King. And so now, right, like we got into this exact situation that I sort of alluded to at the beginning of this turn. Do you use this will to remove Palantir, or do you just use it to move again? I think, given where the Fellowship is, moving again here makes a lot of sense. You want to put yourself 3 spaces outside of Mordor because that gives you, with 5 dice, a good shot at making it next turn. So yeah, my opponent goes and moves again. I hit them. Fine. They take the 3, puts them out of range of Morgul Wound, which makes sense. So I attack into Woodland Realm here, play Great Host, sure, against a Confusion, hit myself once, no big deal. But my opponent gets 3, so a total of 4 hits back. It's a good thing I took a big army, and that I rolled really well that first round. So yeah, I just do a Desperate Battle here to clean this out. Didn't need the Desperate Battle, but wanted to guarantee that I took the stronghold there. Excuse me. Okay, so I draw candles, and I draw Orcs multiplying again. And I'm wondering if people can predict what I discard here. I still wonder why this is what I picked. I think it's right, but ultimately I discard Mortal Wound, and the reason for that is like I, I, I if I was going to be cycling character cards, I am guaranteed that I can cycle Nazgul Strike and Candles of Corpses. It is not guaranteed that I can cycle Mortal Wound because it would require that my opponent is revealed. And so I was trying. I'm assuming that even if my opponent rolls a will this turn, they're going to want to use it for movement rather than removing Palantir. So I discarded Morgul Wound because they took if they hadn't taken that whole 3, if they'd taken a random instead, I probably would have held Morgul Wound because then it would be worth 2 corruption. But because it was only worth 1, because the Nazgul Strike is going to be worth, on average more than 1, and Candles is going to be worth on average 1.5, I decided that's what I decided to throw out. And the cycling thought is really what was front and center for me, is which of these cards are playable no matter what happens with the Fellowship this turn. People are welcome to disagree with that choice. Made sense to me. So so now I roll 4 additional eyes and 2 Palantirs. My opponent does not roll a will, and if my opponent wants to get into Mordor this turn, they cannot afford to give me a ring to remove Palantir. So they go ahead and move. I hit them, draw an eye. Okay, so Mortal Wound would have been playable, but again, that's not knowable. So my opponent takes a random, gets Gimli, perfect. But because they have Erebor, or because they have Strider here, right? If Strider had been lost as a random there, that would have been devastating because then they for sure couldn't have gotten into Mordor this turn. But they have Strider, so it's still entirely possible to get into Mordor this turn. I play Candles, I get 3. So now, I am wondering, is this going to be a corruption game? And then I top deck Cruel Weather from that cycle. And so now I know that I'm actually rooting for my opponent. I graciously accept a ring. God, that's funny. Yeah, helpfully letting my opponent know that they can remove Palantir with a ring. They just have to give up getting into Mordor this turn. So, I have Cruel Weather here, but what I'm really hoping for now is for my opponent to not be revealed. Because if my opponent is revealed on this move, I can't play Cruel Weather. And they are going to get the last action of the round because I rolled so many eyes. So, I forgot. Yeah, so I forgot about this. My opponent chose not to try to get in this turn. It's been a week since we played this match, so I had forgotten that because of the 5 eyes, probably in the level of corruption that my opponent now has, just didn't want to take, basically 2 guaranteed hits, maybe a third tile. And, if they hadn't been revealed, maybe 4 with Nazgul Strike, right? Like just, it could have been, a little ugly. But as you can see, when I played Half Orcs and Goblin Men there, I drew a character card because I'm now looking at a Fellowship that is at effective -2, but I have Orc Patrol and Nazgul Strike and Cruel Weather. So, I'm thinking I could maybe keep them out again for another turn and continue to just drop cards on them that hurt. So, given what ended up happening this turn, I am kicking myself a little bit for getting rid of Mortal Wound, but I still think in the moment it was probably the right call. Maybe getting rid of Orcs multiplying again or something would have made more sense. But at this when this turn started, I was still very much on the military victory route. But as you can see, not so much anymore. So I play Orc Patrol here, draw an eye, classic. No, and I said classic in the chat. My opponent plays There Is Another Way to Heal. Fair enough. That's one of those cards that clogs up your hand. It's great to get the move effect with Golem as well, but ultimately it still provides that 1 heal, and that 1 heal is big when you're up at 7 corruption. Great. So I now get a red tile. Fine. And what do I discard? Yeah, so that time I discarded Orcs Multiplying again. Because I am, you know, at this point, thinking pretty seriously about a pivot to a corruption game. Especially with how many cycles I've gotten of character cards using Palantir here. So now I just, this game, my opponent now rolls again. Not not enough moves to get into Mordor without using a ring. And, he can't know this, but if he's not revealed on this first move, he's not getting into Mordor this turn. And I think, he's a little bit frustrated from that Urg, which is fair, This game can be brutal to free people in moments exactly like this. Uh, so I keep shuffling some armies around. Fine, you even if you're going corruption, you still have to keep some amount of military pressure on because you need to force the Fellowship to keep moving in situations where it would rather sit and draw cards or not move against 5 dice in the box um, when they're in Mordor. So even in a corruption game, military pressure is still relevant. And this is another turn where I've rolled 2 Palantirs just like last turn, but my opponent can't afford to give me a ring to stop me from playing them if they're really planning on getting into Mordor this turn. So go ahead and play a red tile. This is a little bit of cloak and dagger stuff again, where I'm sort of indicating that I anticipate my opponent will get into Mordor this turn. So I'm going to start dumping my red tiles, even though I already have Cruel Weather in hand. Um, you know, does that actually change how my opponent's going to play? Probably not. But it is just a minor bit of signaling that I expect them to get into Mordor when indeed I know for a fact that that's unlikely. Unless they move and unless my opponent moves and gets revealed, which would actually be the best thing for them here. But unfortunately for Euthoric, their move did not hit, which allows me to Cruel Weather them back, and I choose to draw a strategy card there. Interesting. So, normally I think when you're playing Shadow, the best thing to do is like commit fully into strategy or into military or into corruption, and I seem to be walking the line and still maybe doing both. That's usually not a recipe for success. Just, I, yeah, it's generally you want to go all in on one, especially by turn 5. But as you can see here, I'm still keeping my military options open. Like I just chose to draw a strategy card there after playing a character card. Fine. Not sure that's exactly right, but I'm probably also looking at the board state and thinking I want to batter down Lorien this turn, and probably put Erebor under siege this turn. Let's see if that's what I actually did. I don't remember. Yeah, so I bring. So this is a good play here. Mustering the dwarves may seem strange, but my opponent is sort of wisely assessing that what I'm planning to do with my last dice here are use an army to move up to Withered Heath and combine in East Rune, then put Erebor, then like maybe put Erebor under siege, and then consolidate uh, with the Easterlings that are in South Rune or East Rune. So my opponent's trying to force me to do something else, right? Or if I choose to go that route, he's going to get a chance to muster in Iron Hills. If he musters again and I put Erebor under siege with the Witch King and then try to bring in the Easterlings, he's going to get a chance to muster in Iron Hills. And I think he's probably holding a scouts at this point. He doesn't know that I have a swarm of bats, but I think I really appreciate this play. However, there's a pretty clear way to circumvent it, which is just don't bring the guys from North Rune, right? So, and that's what I do. So I just immediately like, yeah, it's slightly more optimal to have these units from North Rune with me. But what I don't want is to be allowing my opponent to muster. And I'm perfectly happy to attack into if he musters the dwarves again. I'm perfectly happy to attack into Erebor with the Witch King army from Withered Heath. and dare him to take a field battle with the cards that I'm holding, especially. So my opponent kind of forced that action by mustering the dwarves, but ultimately, like, it just cost me bringing those 2 extra regulars, but I still have a 6/3/5 army up there. So is it gonna make a huge difference? Probably not. I think mustering the north with all 3 of those might have made a bigger difference, actually. And so you can see with that second action there, I know that now that we're mustering the north, I'm gonna want to cover up Carrick at some point. So I mosey on over from Mount Gundabad. And yeah, my opponent moves north down. Now, with those 3 musters, something else that could have been done there is, rather than mustering the dwarves once, mustering the north 3 times, or mustering Gondor, and then putting 2 elites into Dol Amroth. I think ultimately, like, the those are probably one of the 2 things I would have done. It would depend on what cards I'm holding, which of those I would have done. But I understand, like, my opponent was trying to read what my play was going to be here, and assuming that I would bring Northrune into Eastrune, and he'd have time to muster something. But I just chose to upend that, I think. Um, and so, like, a more guaranteed fruitful use of those musters would have been all into North, or all into Gondor. Okay, and so I go ahead and attack Erebor. I assume I'm just playing a Swarm of Bats here. Yeah, against a Confusion. That's great. Yeah, and I get 3 hits and block a Confusion. My opponent only gets 1 back. So, Erebor's kind of already looking a little doomed. Oh, and man. And the card that I cycle into is Corsairs. So, yeah, that's making the use of those musters into Dol Amroth look like it would have been the right play. Again, there's no way to know that I have Corsairs, but you have to assume that your opponent's going to get it at some point. So then I do use one of the Deadly Strifes just to try to finish this thing off. And I only get 2 hits. That's not great. My opponent gets 3 back. Huh. And I press. Go no card. Get a sudden strike. They get a hit. It's pretty good. And I miss again. Then my opponent gets another hit. Okay, so what looked like it was going to be an absolute stomp of Erebor after that first round has turned into a little bit of a fiasco. And the North are only 1 away. Now think about if all 3 of those musters had gone in for the North, huh? Yeah. Because that army in Erebor has been deleted. Like, if you get a muster, if the North gets a muster into Dale here, the Dew line is in big trouble. So I go ahead and downgrade, and then I just play a Deadly Strife. So, it feels bad because if I was, that doesn't feel good. Like, if I was gonna use that Deadly Strife, maybe I should have just used it in that second round of, or no, in the third round of combat after that first Deadly Strife only got 2 hits. And then still had, what, 5 hit points, maybe 6 left in Erebor instead of what I'm about to have, which is 2. So now I'm out at Deadly Strife and 4 additional hit points. Not good. Yeah, I say now we have troubles. Like, I just went from feeling like I was in a really good position in this game to feeling very scared about the status of the Dew line because of how absolutely beat up that army in Erebor got. Would have been nice to have Gron last turn, but I've top decked some really nice cards, so I'm not gonna complain. Yeah. Okay. So here we have another turn where my opponent has finally rolled a will, but I have again rolled no Palantir. So, the Palantir of Orthanc has already gotten me, the Shadow player, like 6, 7 cycles here. And it's just that drip, drip, drip effect of that card that, on maybe at any given turn, it doesn't feel like the right move to remove it, but sometimes it just sits there and it allows you to cycle and cycle and cycle, and then you get into things like Cruel Weather and you get into things like Corsairs. Now, this my opponent's action dice have just been so cruel. Like in the last 2 turns, when they needed uh, one additional move to get into Mordor, they didn't roll it. And now this turn, when what they really want are musters to turn the dew line into a catastrophe, they roll 0 musters. I mean, it's just so rude. Like, I, I, I feel bad for Futhoric here because, like, if he had rolled 3 musters here, it becomes a very different game. Because then there's just going to be a ton of mustering in Dale, and potential retakes of Erebor, potential retakes of Woodland Realm. But that's not what happened. And I rolled enough musters that I'm going to be able to bring that tiny army I left behind in North Rune up to help and to squash Dale. So yeah, it's going to basically cost me my entire turn. But I bought myself an entire extra turn with that Cruel Weather top deck. So, you know, the I think my opponent went from being in a really good position at the start of this turn to now, because of these action dice, being in just not as good of a position. So yeah, when you wanted musters. So my opponent moves, is missed. I start mustering, muster again, and then yeah, bring the Witch King out to combine with to have, so I have 5 dice and all my leadership without spending. So I'm spending basically a half move, an extra half move compared to spending a C. Fine, whatever. I think that's probably slightly more efficient, especially because I know I want to use those C dice to either go to Lorien to beat up Lorien, or to play Corsairs and to fly to Dol Amroth to beat up Dol Amroth. So, oh yeah, okay. I move out of Minas Morgul here with the intention of that army being what I may eventually take Pelargir with, because I had this extra half move to spare here. And I anticipate that I might have another extra half move later in covering up Carrick, which would mean that South Athelian army can move to West Harador and be poised to take Pelargir immediately after I play Corsairs. It depends, of course, on where my opponent chooses to muster, etc., but that was the thought behind that. So my opponent plays Faramir's Rangers here. Yeah, that's pretty good. So that plan of taking Pelargir is probably up in smoke. But I attack Dale. Yeah. I changed my mind a couple times. Changed my mind a couple times about what die I want to use. Ultimately, the reason that I was thinking about that is I was trying to figure out exactly what the rest of my turn was going to look like with respect to Corsairs and Black Captain. And I was a little bit undecided on whether I was going to try to take Dale here. Ultimately, the reason I used this C die is because I wanted to leave the extra. I wanted to have the option of playing Corsairs and then also covering up Carrick, instead of having the option of playing Black Captain to take, say, Lorien, and then flying the Nazgul again down to Dol Amroth. I decided that what was more important this turn was fully shutting down the Dew line. I play a Relentless Assault. Opponent plays a no quarter. Sure. And I take 1 hit. Sure. Yep, and I get my 2. My opponent gets 2 back. And Dale is covered up. So, do you muster in a character? Yeah, I think so. I think that's a good use of that. But something very important has happened by my opponent playing Faramir and my opponent playing Help Unlooked For. They have no strategy cards left in hand. And so that lets me know that I basically have a free run on Dol Amroth here with Corsairs. Like, he's not holding any strategy cards, so he can't be holding Círdan or Imrahil. And so I decide to take advantage of that. And knowing that he can't play. He's not going to have any reinforcements down there. I decide to hold Black Captain and hold Grand for some other moment, and use Nazgul Strike to reposition down into Lemroth, and get that extra. Try to get an extra hunt on the Fellowship on their way into Mordor, but fail. Oh yeah, I'd forgotten to draw my strategy card cycle when I attacked Dale, and because technically, according to the rules, it is both players' responsibility to remember the card draw, and it's not optional. We went ahead and resolved it the following turn. So yep, my opponent plays Smeagol, and then I just beat up on a pretty weak Dol Amroth here. Oh, I forgot that I totally whiffed on the second round. Yeah, there they are. There's my sixes. Okay. So my opponent is finally into Mordor. Like, so frustrating, because this could have been a game in which my opponent got into Mordor turn 4, and instead it is now turn 7. Or rather, they could have started in Mordor turn 5, and it is now starting in Mordor turn 7. So they lost, because of action dice rolls and cruel weather, they lost 2 full turns getting into Mordor, which feels so bad. And looking at the board now, Lorien is under threat. Like, I'm gonna take Pelargir. Are they really gonna retake Dale from Carrick? They probably won't have the dice to do it. So this game is looking pretty signed, sealed, and delivered at this point. And now I have not one but 2 of the Palantir attack cards for sieges. Yeah. So the one thing that could potentially save my opponent is me just rolling a ton of eyes. So I was like, oh great, I only need some. If you look at my hand, I literally only need 3 attacks to do this. 4 would be nice, and honestly, 4 of those attacks, 3 of them could have been Palantirs. What I didn't want was this. Like, the way I'd love to do this turn is move into Lamadon, attack Pelargir, use Black Captain commands to fly up to Lorien, do 1 round in Lorien, and then play Grond or Fighting Uruk-hai. And, the only way that didn't happen is if I rolled a bunch of eyes and a bunch of musters. And that is exactly what I ended up doing. So, I still, this turn, even with a roll like this, with just 3 attacks in hand, because of the cards I have in hand and the way the board is, I can still win this turn. And now, because my opponent rolls 3 moves, I assume I will have to win this turn. So I go ahead and bring in, but it went from looking like a completely decided game now looks a little bit less decided, because I would have to take Lorien in 3 rounds of combat as opposed to 5, right? Because I'm going to have to rely on Black Captain and pressing down with my elites, as opposed to getting around from Black Captain and then, or 6 rounds, and then playing Grond or Fighting Uruk-hai, and having those 3 free presses and then 2 additional presses. So yeah, when my opponent hits a blue tile, so they defend Pelargir. I think that's a mistake. Like, I think the only thing to do, like, while yes, hitting an eye would not be fun, the hunt pool is huge. For all the messing around with the Fellowship I didn't pull that many tiles out. Mostly what Cruel Weather was big, but like Orc Patrol hit an eye. I haven't pulled that many tiles, and so I think this should have been a move. I go ahead and attack Pelargir. I use Grond here because I don't need it for Lorien anymore. And I roll a lot of 3s. But ultimately, like, getting that essentially free first round, where my opponent has the extra defense, and I'm sort of expecting to get almost no hits, but against a 4 combat dice and a reroll, you're expecting to take maybe 2 back, and sometimes as many as 4. Having that Dread and Despair to to just survive that first turn, and get to where you're on even footing, hitting on fives, is super useful. So my opponent wisely withdraws, um, and recruits Enemies Tirith. Yeah, setting up for basically, trying to continue to stretch the game out. And so I recruit more Nazgul, and you know, does recruiting more Nazgul there give away the fact that I'm about to play um, either something like Black Captain or Ringwraiths? Not necessarily, right? Like, I also need to defend Pelargir and Dale and have enough leadership to take Lorien. So, I felt like getting more Nazgul on the board was the best thing I could do right there. Um, and I think this is also a mistake. My opponent now goes on the military offensive. I think this should have been another move. I get it. He was worried about corruption, but again, the hunt pool is just so big. I think you just have to take your chances here. That you're going to pull a 1 or a 0 or a 2 or even a 3, right? Like, all of those are good. As long as you don't pull an I or a red, which are only 6 of the tiles, like, this move is just not that big of a deal. And so I play Black Captain and go for the win. And oh, my opponent didn't realize that I was at 8 victory points. Yeah, so I start with a We Come to Kill. This is when that card, I mean, it's not great, but it's when this card will be the most effective. Fine. Get 2 hits. My opponent gets 2 back. In the post, I get 1. Great. And remember that entire discussion I had about should you bring that North Dunland regular with you to Lorien? I mean, look at my hand. What is my most playable combat card here? It is a Devilry. And I roll 4 5s with it. So, you know, turns out bringing that North Dunland regular along was a game-winning move. I may still have won because my opponent is 4 steps out, but I think this speaks to sort of the value of having that regular with you, or that regular Isengard unit in Lorien, because at some point you're gonna draw these Devilries, and if you draw one of the 3 Devilries in the deck before you draw uh, what before you draw one of the Isengard recruit cards, um, its most playable combat is in Lorien usually. Um, by virtue of having pulled half orcs and goblin men as well. Like, if I'd gotten one of these, I could have used it up in Erebor or something. But yeah, here that one regular from North Dunland um, gives access to essentially the game-winning card. Yeah, so then we talk about the game a little bit, but ultimately I think the MVP of this game for Shadow was the Palantir Vorthink. It just got me access to a ton of highly useful cards at pivotal moments in the game, and I think at the end of the day I got, what did I say, 6 or 7 cycles out of it. But the speed with which I got, I wouldn't have gotten Cruel Weather in time without it. I probably wouldn't have gotten Black Captain in time without it. My Corsairs would have been at least a turn later. Those have big impacts on the game. So, the lesson I think many of us keep learning over and over and over again is, if there's a good opportunity to remove the Palantir Vorthink, get rid of it. And then Euthoric and I end up talking about that quite a bit after the game. And then, he also agrees that Palantir was the MVP of this match. So thank you all for listening. I'll have our second game up shortly. We played our second game yesterday, and I realized I was pretty far behind in casting this match since it was from over a week ago. So I'll try to get that one up before the end of the weekend as well. All right. Happy Thursday, everybody. Bye.